The air was thick with the scent of antiseptic and fear. In a makeshift hospital set within the crumbling walls of a former school in Crete, 1941, the sound of distant artillery echoed like a heartbeat against the backdrop of a silent storm. Nurses moved with urgency, their hands trembling slightly as they bandaged wounds and administered care to the men who had once been soldiers, now reduced to mere shadows of their former selves. Each breath felt heavy. The weight of the world seemed to rest on their shoulders. In a small room lit by flickering oil lamps, a nurse stood over a patient, her hands hovering as if caught in a web of uncertainty. He was a young man, perhaps no older than 20, with wild eyes that spoke of unvoiced horrors. As she assessed his wounds, her gaze flicked to the doorway, where a faint shadow lingered. She could feel her heart race, her breath catch in her throat. Outside, the conflict loomed. They had been warned that enemy troops were advancing, yet here they were, surrounded by their own. It was not merely a question of survival, it was a test of humanity. The nurses had been instructed to care for all, regardless of uniform. The fine line between friend and foe blurred in the chaos, and the weight of that decision pressed heavily on their chests. As she pulled the bandage tight, the young man winced, a sharp intake of breath cutting through the silence. She offered a soft apology, her voice barely above a whisper. The room was filled with the sound of her heartbeat, a rhythmic reminder of the fragility of life. The young man, still gazing at her, nodded, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Outside the hospital, the distant rumble of engines grew louder, a sound that sent shivers down her spine. The nurses exchanged worried glances, their eyes darting toward the window, where shadows moved in the fading light. She could feel the tension in the air pulsing with each tick of the clock on the wall, every second stretched into eternity. Suddenly, the doors swung open, and a medic rushed in, his face pale and drawn. "They're coming," he gasped, the words tumbling from his lips like stones falling into still water. Panic rippled through the room, a silent scream echoing in their minds. The nurses' hands became frantic, a flurry of motion in the face of impending chaos. They had no time to think, only to react. As the medic spoke of troop movements and skirmishes, she felt her focus narrowing, the world around her becoming a blur. The sounds of the hospital faded into a muffled hum, and her heart beat loudly in her ears. Her hands trembled, but she forced them to steady, gripping the edge of the table as if it were a lifeline. She felt the weight of every choice she had made, every patient she had tended to, crashing over her like waves against a rocky shore. Minutes passed, or was it hours? Time became meaningless as the reality of their situation crashed into her consciousness. The distant sounds of conflict grew closer, an ominous reminder that they were not safe here. She could see the faces of her fellow nurses grimly set, their expressions a tapestry of resolve and fear. They were all in this together, a fragile alliance held together by the shared thread of compassion. The door swung open once more, and a group of soldiers entered, their boots heavy against the wooden floor. The atmosphere shifted, the air crackled with tension as they stood, eyes scanning the room. The nurses froze, hands poised mid-action. The soldiers were not those they had expected, not the enemy but their own. German troops caught in the whirlwind of war, yet finding themselves in a strange position of mercy. "Stay calm," one of the soldiers called out, his voice firm yet cautious as if he were speaking to frightened animals. He moved toward the young man on the bed, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. The nurse's heart raced as she watched, her breath held tight in her chest. What would happen next? Would the soldiers see the patients as mere objects, or would they recognize their humanity? The soldier leaned closer to the young man, eyes searching for signs of pain. The nurse felt an instinctive urge to protect her patient, to shield him from the very hands that could bring danger. Yet, in that moment, something shifted. The soldier's gaze softened, and she saw the hesitation, an unspoken connection that transcended uniforms and allegiances. It was as if they were all caught in a moment of shared vulnerability amidst the chaos. A silence enveloped the room, thick and palpable. The nurses stood frozen, eyes wide as they absorbed the reality of the scene unfolding before them. The soldier began to speak, his voice low and steady, explaining what they would do to help. The other soldiers joined him, their actions tentative, almost reverent. They moved among the patients with care, hands surprisingly gentle as they tended to wounds, each touch a silent apology for the circumstances that had brought them to this fragile moment. In the corner of the room, a nurse watched, her breath still held tight. She felt a flicker of hope igniting within her, a small flame that fought against the darkness surrounding them. The soldiers were not just faceless enemies, they were human beings, caught in the same tempest of fear and uncertainty. Her mind raced, battling against the fear that had gripped her since the moment the conflict began. Time slipped away as the soldiers worked alongside the nurses, the sounds of the outside world fading into a distant memory. Each bandage wrapped, each wound cleaned, was a battle won against despair. The room filled with a sense of purpose, a shared mission to protect life in the face of death. There were moments of hesitation, of doubt, but they pressed on, hands working in unison, a silent orchestra playing a song of resilience. As the final bandage was tied, the soldiers stepped back, their breaths mingling with those of the nurses. They shared a glance, a moment of understanding that transcended words. Outside, the rumble of conflict continued, but inside, there was a fragile peace, a recognition of humanity against the backdrop of war. The nurse felt her heart swell, pride mingling with disbelief. In that small, makeshift hospital, amidst the chaos of war, they had forged an unexpected alliance. It was a testament to the strength of the human spirit, the ability to connect even in the darkest times. And as the echoes of battle faded into the distance, she understood that this moment would linger long after the war was over. A quiet revolution of compassion in a world turned upside down. A dark cloud of uncertainty loomed over the makeshift hospital, each breath heavy with anticipation. The flickering oil lamps cast long shadows on the walls, revealing faces etched with worry. Nurses moved through the cramped space, their hands shaking subtly as they tended to the wounded. Every sound echoed in the silence, the faint rustle of bandages, the gentle clink of glass vials, and the soft moans of patients, creating a symphony of despair. In a corner room, a nurse leaned over a man whose chest rose and fell in a slow, labored rhythm. His face was pale, and his eyes fluttered open and shut as if fighting a battle within. She could feel her own breath hitching as she watched him, the weight of the world settling on her shoulders. The distant artillery fire was a constant reminder that life outside was falling apart. Yet here, in this moment, she was a guardian against the chaos. Her fingers grazed his forehead, brushing away sweat as she whispered words of comfort. He stared back at her, his gaze a mixture of fear and gratitude. She wanted to tell him that everything would be okay, but the uncertainty hung in the air like a thick fog. The war had stripped away the certainties of life, and now every word felt like a lie. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from outside, rattling the windows and sending a jolt of adrenaline through her body. She froze, her hands hovering above him. She could hear her heart pounding in her ears, a frantic rhythm that matched the chaos surrounding them. The young man's eyes widened, and she could see the flicker of panic reflected in his gaze. "Stay calm," she urged softly, her voice barely a whisper. "They're just trying to scare us." But even as she spoke, a part of her wondered if she believed her own words. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in as the distant sounds of conflict surged closer. Outside, the nurses could hear the shouts of men, voices raised in urgency, filled with fear and determination. They exchanged glances, their breaths held as if waiting for a storm to break. The tension thickened, a silence pressed against the walls, amplifying every sound. The nurse's fingers trembled as she reached for supplies, her mind racing with thoughts of all that could go wrong. Suddenly the door burst open, and a figure stepped into the room, breathless and wild-eyed. It was a fellow nurse, her uniform disheveled and dirt streaked across her face. "They're coming," she gasped, her hands shaking as she clutched the doorframe. "We have to prepare." The air turned electric, charged with fear and urgency. The young man on the bed tried to sit up, but the nurse quickly pressed him back down, her voice steady despite the chaos. "You need to stay still, we'll take care of you." She turned to the other nurse, their eyes locking in a moment of shared understanding. They were not merely caring for the wounded, they were standing on the front lines of humanity itself. Outside, the sounds of boots marching echoed, a rhythmic beat that sent shivers down her spine. She could see shadows moving beyond the window, dark figures against the fading light. Her mind raced with the knowledge that these figures could be enemies, yet she couldn't disregard the fact that her duty was to care for all those who entered. The nurses rallied, their breaths mingling in a collective gasp as they prepared to receive the next wave of wounded. The tension was palpable, hanging thick in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. Every detail felt magnified, the sound of a cough in the corner, the rustle of fabric, the distant rumble of engines. It was as if time had slowed, each second stretching into eternity, and each heartbeat echoed louder than the last. Suddenly the door swung open again, and a group of soldiers poured in, their faces smeared with dirt and fear. They were not the enemy, they were fellow humans, caught in the same madness. The nurses instinctively stepped back, their hearts racing, yet they quickly regained their composure, the silent oath of care guiding their actions. "Help us!" one soldier shouted, his voice cracking. He held another man in his arms, a soldier whose leg had been badly injured. The nurses rushed forward, instinctively reaching for the wounded man. As they worked, the tension in the room shifted. The soldiers, once viewed through the lens of enemy and ally, became a part of the same struggle. With hurried hands, they wrapped the injured leg, murmuring words of reassurance. The air was a tangled web of emotion, fear, hope, desperation. The scent of sweat and antiseptic filled the room, a reminder of the fragility of life. As she pressed the bandages tightly, the nurse noticed the soldier's eyes, wide and pleading, searching for reassurance in a world turned upside down. "Stay with us," she implored, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. The soldier nodded, and she held his gaze, willing him to find strength in that connection. Each passing moment felt like a lifetime, filled with the tension of uncertainty and the hope of survival. Outside, the sounds of conflict grew louder, a cacophony that threatened to engulf them all. The nurses moved with urgency, their bodies working in perfect harmony as they continued their efforts. The silence of doubt had been replaced with an unspoken determination, not to fight but to care, to heal. As the hours stretched on, they settled into a rhythm, the mechanical repetition of tasks becoming a lifeline in the chaos. They focused on the small details, the placement of a bandage, the careful assessment of wounds, the gentle touch of a hand on a shoulder. In this makeshift hospital, under the flickering light, humanity shone through the cracks of despair. The night wore on, the distant sounds of conflict fading into a heavy silence. The nurses exchanged weary glances, their breaths slowing, the fear momentarily set aside as they worked together. In that cocoon of shared purpose, they found strength, understanding that in a world devoid of certainty, the only thing they could offer was compassion. Then, amid the tension, a flicker of warmth ignited in her chest. They were not just saving lives, they were defying the darkness, reminding themselves and the men around them that even in the face of disaster, kindness could prevail. Each life they touched was a testament to their humanity, and in that moment, they were not defined by uniforms but by shared breaths, whispered comforts, and the unwavering resolve to stand firm against the chaos that sought to unravel them all. It was another long day in the makeshift hospital, the air thick with the scent of antiseptic and the weight of unspoken fears. The nurses moved with a frantic grace, their hands trembling slightly as they tended to the wounded. Each gesture was a dance of urgency and quiet desperation, accompanied by the muffled sounds of distant artillery, like a heartbeat echoing the collective anxiety of those trapped within the crumbling walls of the former school. In one dimly lit room, a nurse named Greta stood over a young soldier. His face was pale, framed by a tangle of dark hair, and his wild eyes seemed to flicker with the remnants of nightmares he could not express. She could almost feel the ghosts of his memories hovering around them, whispering tales of valor now buried beneath layers of pain. As she assessed the jagged tear in his uniform, her fingers hovered, trembling with the weight of the task ahead. "Breathe," she murmured, though her own breath came in shallow gasps. The sound of the ticking clock filled the silence, each tick a reminder that time was slipping away, that every second spent here was both a gift and a curse. Outside, the muted sounds of chaos grew closer, an imminent threat lurking just beyond the fragile walls of safety. Suddenly, the door creaked open, and a fellow nurse stepped inside, her face pale and drawn. "Greta," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They say the enemy is advancing." Greta's heart sank. She turned to the soldier, whose gaze remained fixed on her, unblinking, a mixture of fear and trust swirling in his eyes. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, and she felt a shiver run through her. The nurses had been told to treat all patients with the same care, regardless of their uniform, but the reality was more complicated. Fear threatened to choke her resolve. "Stay with me," Greta said softly to the young man, her hands now steady as they continued to work, wrapping his wounds with practiced precision. She focused on the task, blocking out the chaos that surrounded them, each bandage a barrier against the encroaching darkness. The minutes dragged on, and the distant rumbles intensified, reverberating through the building like thunder. Greta's breaths quickened, her heart racing in tandem with the sounds of war outside. The air felt alive, charged with tension, as if the very walls were holding their breath. She could feel the young soldier's gaze upon her, unwavering, and it anchored her in that moment. "Why are you helping me?" he asked suddenly, his voice raw and unsteady. "Because I must," she replied, the words escaping her lips before she could think. "We all must." The truth of her response lingered in the air, heavy and poignant. She was afraid, but fear had become a companion in this chaos. They were all in it together, bound by a shared humanity that transcended uniforms and allegiances. Greta tied off the last bandage and stepped back to assess her work. The soldier's breathing had steadied, but the tension was still palpable. Her own hands shook slightly as she wiped the sweat from her brow. Outside, the thunder grew louder, echoing through the fractured walls, cutting through the thin veil of sanctuary they had tried to maintain. "Do you think they will come in?" he asked, his eyes wide with fear. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But if they do, we'll face it together." The soldier nodded, and for a brief moment, their fears intertwined, uniting them in a bond forged in the fires of adversity. Greta allowed herself a fleeting smile, a shared understanding that in the midst of horror, there could still be a flicker of hope. But the moment was short-lived as the door burst open again, this time with a nurse rushing in, her face a mask of terror. "They're here, the enemy is outside." Panic surged through the room and Greta felt her heart clench. Instinctively, she stepped in front of the soldier, her body blocking the doorway. "Stay back," she commanded, her voice strong despite the tremor in her hands. The other nurses hesitated, their eyes wide and desperate. Silence enveloped them, thick and suffocating, each second stretching into eternity. Greta could hear the rapid thrum of her heartbeat echoing in her ears, drowning out everything else. The soldier's breath came faster, and she glanced back, meeting his gaze. "Trust me," she whispered, though a part of her felt the weight of that promise. Outside, boots echoed on the ground, the sound of voices rising and falling in urgent tones. The air pulsated with tension, a collective breath held between fear and resolve. Greta's mind raced, searching for a way to shield the young man behind her. "What do we do?" One of the nurses finally broke the silence, her voice shaking as the reality of their situation set in. "We continue to care for the wounded. We stay true to our oath," Greta replied, her voice now steady. "They are not just soldiers. They are human beings." The resolve in her voice silenced the room. The nurses exchanged glances, a flicker of determination igniting in their eyes. It was a decision made not from courage, but from the simple recognition of their shared humanity. In the distance, the rumble of engines grew louder, drowning out their thoughts. They braced themselves, breath held tight, as the shadows of conflict loomed ever closer. The weight of their choices wrapped around them like a heavy shroud, pressing against their chests. Then, the first sound of splintering wood reached them, and Greta felt her heart skip a beat. Time slowed, each tick of the clock now an agonizing reminder of their vulnerability. The door held firm, but for how long? Greta felt the young soldier's hand grasp hers, his grip firm and reassuring. In that moment, amidst the impending chaos, they were united by something greater than fear, an unspoken declaration of solidarity in the face of uncertainty. As the door suddenly burst open, their eyes met in a silent promise. Whatever lay beyond, they would face it together. In the cacophony of war, amidst the echoes of humanity, they held on to the fragile thread of hope, tethered to one another by the very essence of life itself. The tension in the air thickened like smoke, swirling around the makeshift hospital as the nurses exchanged anxious glances. Each heartbeat echoed a silent plea for safety, a desperate wish that the chaos outside would spare them, if only for a moment. The young man on the bed shifted slightly, his labored breaths breaking the silence. The nurse beside him remained poised, an anchor in the storm, her hands trembling ever so slightly as they hovered near his face. The light from the oil lamps flickered again, casting shadows that danced across the walls, distorting the expressions of those present. Each flicker seemed to mirror the uncertainty that gripped their hearts. Outside, the sounds of conflict grew louder, a cacophony of shouting and the ominous rumble of artillery fire. The nurse could feel the weight of the world pressing down on her. Every breath she took felt like a stolen moment, a brief escape from the chaos just beyond the thin walls. "Stay with me," she whispered, forcing her voice to hold steady, even as her insides quivered. The young man's eyes locked onto hers, searching for reassurance, a beacon of hope in the darkness. She leaned closer, her fingers brushing against his cheek where sweat mingled with dirt, the remnants of the battlefield clinging to him like a ghost. Time stretched painfully, a taut string ready to snap. Outside, the voices intensified, rising and falling in urgency. She wondered what was happening out there, if her fellow nurses were safe, if they too felt the same fear gnawing at their insides. Her mind raced with questions that had no answers, each thought more frantic than the last. A sudden silence fell, a quiet so profound it felt almost unnatural. It was as if the world outside had paused, holding its breath alongside them. The nurse glanced at the door, her heart pounding as she waited for the sound to return, her body poised as if ready to spring into action. But in that moment, all that existed was the rhythmic sound of the young man's breathing, a fragile reminder of life amid the impending doom. Then the door burst open, and a figure stumbled in, breathless. The nurse's heart raced as she recognized a fellow nurse, her face pale and drawn. "They're advancing," she gasped, her voice shaky. "We need to prepare." Panic rippled through the room. The walls felt as if they were closing in, and the air grew thick with dread. The nurse turned back to the young man, her hands gripping his tightly. "I'll be right back," she promised, though inside she was unsure of what she could offer in the face of such looming danger. She moved swiftly, her mind racing as she gathered supplies, her hands working almost mechanically. Bandages, antiseptic, anything that could help. Each item felt heavy in her grasp, a reminder of the lives hanging in the balance. The world around her faded as she focused on the task at hand, a desperate attempt to maintain control amid the chaos. The young man's eyes followed her, filled with a mix of fear and confusion. "Please," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "don't leave me." "It's okay," she replied, forcing a calmness into her tone even as her own heart raced. "I'm here, I won't go far." She returned to his side, her fingers smoothing the hair back from his forehead. It was a small gesture, but it felt monumental in that moment. The distant sound of gunfire erupted again, louder this time. Her breath caught in her throat, and she could feel the raw tension in the air, palpable and thick. Outside, the conflict escalated, a reminder that time was slipping through their fingers like sand. She could almost taste the fear, bitter and metallic on her tongue. Another nurse entered, her face resolute, but her hands were unsteady. "We need to evacuate the patients," she stated, her voice firm yet tinged with urgency. "Now." The nurse felt her chest tighten, a wave of panic washing over her. "But he needs care," she protested, glancing back at the young man who looked at her with pleading eyes. "We can't stay here," the other nurse insisted, her voice rising slightly. "We'll lose everyone." The young man's gaze flickered from one nurse to the other, confusion evident in his eyes. "What's happening?" he managed, his voice strained. "It's going to be okay," she assured him, though doubt crept into her own heart. "We just need to move you. Stay with us." Time felt distorted, each second stretching into infinity as they prepared to move him. The nurses worked in silence, their breaths mingling in the air, a collective effort to push through the weight of fear. She could hear her own heartbeat thrumming in her ears, drowning out the chaos beyond their walls. As they carefully lifted the young man, she could feel the strength of his body beneath her hands, but it was accompanied by the fragility of his condition. The other nurses moved with purpose, but each step felt like a weight pressing down on her chest. The door loomed ahead, a threshold between safety and chaos, and she hesitated, caught in a moment of indecision. The moment stretched, an eternity where time seemed to freeze. Then, with a deep breath, she pushed through the door, the cool air hitting her like a shock. Outside, reality crashed in, a landscape of uncertainty, shouts echoing in the distance and the acrid smell of smoke hanging in the air. It was a world shattered by turmoil, where every breath felt heavy and every heartbeat echoed a collective fear. As they moved, she stole a glance back at the hospital, the sanctuary that had sheltered them, now a distant memory. Her thoughts raced, torn between the urgency of the moment and the knowledge that every decision could mean life or death. They navigated through the chaos, the young man's breathing steady but shallow. In that moment, everything else faded away. The war, the noise, the fear. It was just him, her, and the fragile thread of hope connecting them. With each step, she felt the weight of their lives resting on her shoulders, a burden that held both terror and resilience. As they made their way into the unknown, every heartbeat echoed the uncertainty of what lay ahead. But within that uncertainty, a glimmer of determination sparked, a resolve to hold on to life, to fight through the fear, and to find a way to carry on. The shadows of doubt lingered, but in that moment, they were not alone. Together, they took one more step forward into the uncertain world, clinging to the hope that guided them through the darkness. The air felt heavy, almost electric, as Greta's hands moved deftly over the bandages, her fingers pulling tight, yet gentle enough not to cause pain. She continued to steal glances at the door, each creak of the floorboards outside sending a shiver down her spine. The muffled sounds of chaos beyond the walls felt like a distant storm, threatening to unleash its fury any moment. The soldier lay still, his breathing shallow, eyes locked onto her face, drawing strength from her presence even as uncertainty loomed. The room, once a simple classroom, was now a sanctuary of sorts, filled with the tools of survival: cotton, gauze, antiseptic. Each item held within it a fragile promise of life. Greta could still remember when this place echoed with laughter and the chatter of students. Now, it was a space fraught with tension, where the faintest sound could spark fear. "Do you hear that?" she asked the soldier, her voice barely above a whisper. He blinked slowly, a slight nod conveying his understanding. The ticking clock on the wall became louder, each tick resonating like a drumbeat, marking the passage of time. 5 minutes had passed since her colleague's warning. Greta shifted her focus back to the soldier, tracing her fingers over his forehead, brushing away the sheen of sweat. "You're going to be okay," she said, even though she could feel the doubt creeping into her mind. Outside, the distant rumble of artillery drew closer, each blast sending a tremor through the walls. Greta closed her eyes for a brief moment, inhaling the sharp, sterile scent of the hospital, hoping it would ground her. Every breath brought the unmistakable odor of fear swirling around her, a bitter reminder of their reality. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, and she found herself gripping the edge of the soldier's bed, her knuckles turning white. Time stretched as she worked, each second feeling like an eternity. The soldier's gaze remained fixed on her, his eyes a mix of anxiety and trust. Greta could feel her own uncertainty rising within her like a tide, threatening to drown her resolve. The nurses had been instructed to treat every wounded man with the same care, regardless of their uniform. It was a directive that felt noble in theory, but in practice it was laden with moral complexity. She glanced at the door again, her heart racing. The sounds outside were rapidly evolving into chaos. Shouts, the crackling of gunfire, and the anguished cries of the wounded mingled in a cacophony that made her stomach churn. The walls felt like they were closing in, and the silence of the room began to wear thin. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "Listen, I need you to focus on my voice, okay?" Greta said softly, her own voice shaking slightly. "Can you do that?" The soldier's eyes widened, and he nodded again, though a sheen of fear glimmered there. She continued, her voice becoming a lifeline in the midst of turmoil. "I'm here with you, just breathe in and out, you can do this." As she spoke, a sudden, loud explosion rocked the building, sending a tremor through the floor. The soldier's eyes flickered with panic. Greta could see the fear etched on his face, the way his muscles tensed involuntarily. She felt her own heart race. "It's okay," she whispered, though she could feel her own breath quickening. "We're safe in here." But as the explosions continued, she wondered how long that safety would last. Each blast echoed like a reminder of their precarious existence. She tried to push away the creeping dread, focusing instead on her patient's needs. She took a moment to gather herself, allowing the silence of the room to cradle her thoughts. "Tell me about your home," she said, trying to coax him from the edge of fear. "What do you miss the most?" The soldier hesitated, his brow furrowing as if searching for the right words. She could see the memories flickering behind his eyes, ghosts of a life before the war. My sister," he finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "She used to sing to me." Greta felt her heart ache at his words. What would she sing? The soldier's lips curled into a faint smile, a flicker of warmth in the midst of despair. "Songs about the stars and dreams," he murmured, his voice trembling. For a moment, the chaos outside faded, replaced by the image of a boy and his sister under a starlit sky. "Stars," Greta echoed softly, allowing herself a moment to imagine them, twinkling in a vast night. "We'll find them again." But even as she spoke, the tension grew thicker in the room. Each blast outside was a brutal reminder that their world was unraveling. She looked at the soldier, his eyes still searching her face, hoping for reassurance. There was a shared silence between them, a bond forged under the weight of uncertainty. Minutes stretched on, their breaths synchronized in the stillness. The soldier's hand, resting on the bed, twitched slightly, betraying his growing anxiety. Greta placed her hand over his, feeling the warmth of his skin against her own. "You're not alone," she said, her voice barely breaking through the tension. The door to the room burst open, and another nurse rushed in, wide-eyed and breathless. "Greta, we need to evacuate," she shouted, fear lacing her words. "They're getting closer." Greta's heart dropped. She turned back to the soldier, whose eyes widened in terror. Time felt suspended, every heartbeat echoing with urgency. "Stay here," she commanded, her voice firm despite the flutter of panic within her. "But," he began, his voice filled with confusion and fear. "Listen to me," she interrupted, her grip tightening around his hand. "Stay still. I'll be right back. Just breathe." She tore her eyes away from him, her mind racing with the weight of her decision. The chaotic sounds outside grew louder, crashing in like relentless waves. With one last look, she turned and sprinted to join her colleagues, her heart pounding. In that moment of separation, she felt the weight of the world pressing down. Outside the makeshift hospital, the reality of war bore down on them, testing the very limits of their humanity. Would they retreat, or would they stand firm against the tide of chaos? As she rushed through the hallways, Greta felt the breath of uncertainty on her neck, its whispers urging her to turn back, to protect the fragile life she had just begun to nurture. But the thundering sounds of conflict called her forward, a silent challenge that would redefine them all. The echoes of the soldier's voice lingered in her mind, a promise that they were all searching for the stars amid the darkness. The silence lingered in the makeshift hospital, an oppressive weight that settled over the weary bodies within. The nurse remained at the young man's side, her mind racing yet strangely calm in the face of uncertainty. She could feel her heartbeat in her ears, a steady drum underscoring the tension that had become their constant companion. It was in this silence that she began to hear the whispers of fear and hope intertwining, a fragile thread that connected them all in this space of chaos. As she held his gaze, she noticed the flicker of understanding in his eyes. He was aware of the danger that loomed outside, yet he clung to her presence like a lifeline. The air was heavy with the scent of antiseptic, mingled with the earthy aroma of sweat and fear. Every breath felt labored, as if the very atmosphere conspired against their survival. The flickering oil lamp cast shadows that danced across the walls, the silhouettes creating a haunting ballet that seemed to mock their plight. Suddenly the distant sound of artillery erupted, shaking the walls as if to remind them of the world beyond. The young man winced, his breath hitching in response. The nurse felt a shudder ripple through her, a collective gasp that echoed between them. She squeezed his hand gently, trying to convey strength to remind him that they were not alone in this moment. There were others beyond these walls, fighting battles of their own, nurses, doctors, and soldiers, who held on to the thread of hope as desperately as they did. Outside, the noise grew more chaotic, punctuated by the shouts of men and the thud of boots against the earth. The nurse closed her eyes for a brief moment, inhaling deeply, trying to steady her racing thoughts. She could not afford to falter. She had to remain focused to help him through this moment. "Stay with me," she repeated softly, her voice a fragile promise. Time slipped away, each second stretching into an eternity. The nurse felt as though she were suspended between two worlds, the world inside, filled with pain and vulnerability, and that outside, a storm of conflict and chaos. She opened her eyes, her gaze unwavering on the young man. In that moment, he was not just a patient, he was a symbol of resilience, of humanity, amidst the madness. Suddenly the door burst open and a figure appeared, a fellow nurse, breathless, her face a mask of urgency. "We need to move. They're coming." The words hung in the air, laden with tension. The nurse's heart raced as she processed the command. She glanced at the young man, knowing they had little time. "Can you walk?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her stomach. He nodded slowly, determination flickering in his eyes. She felt a surge of relief. Together, they could face whatever awaited them. With trembling hands, she helped him sit up. Every movement felt like a careful negotiation with time. The other nurse moved to assist, her eyes scanning the room, searching for anyone else in need. The air was thick with urgency, every heartbeat a countdown to the unknown. "Help me with him," the nurse instructed, her voice firm yet steady. Together they supported the young man, their hands gripping his arms as they eased him off the bed. His legs trembled beneath him, but he pressed forward, drawing strength from the very air around him. As they moved towards the door, the sounds of chaos outside grew louder, drowning out their thoughts. The nurse could feel her pulse quickening, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Each step felt monumental, a shift in the balance of their lives. "Keep moving," she urged, her voice steady. "We're almost there." They made it to the door, the threshold between this fragile sanctuary and the outside world. The nurse hesitated, her instincts screaming for caution. She could feel the heat radiating from the chaos beyond, the uncertain safety of their next steps weighing heavily in the air. Then, without warning, the door flew open wider, revealing the chaos outside in stark clarity. The young man flinched, his eyes widening as he caught sight of the turmoil. The nurse's breath caught in her throat, her heart racing as she pulled him closer. "Stay close to me," she whispered, her tone soft but urgent. The world that awaited them was a tempest, and they were mere leaves caught in its grip. They stepped out into the chaos, an overwhelming symphony of sound and movement. The nurse's heart pounded, the rhythm echoing in her ears as they moved through the makeshift corridors of the hospital. The sight of wounded soldiers, nurses rushing about, the scent of smoke and fear enveloped them. Each face they passed told a story of endurance, of survival against the odds. Yet amidst this chaos, there were flickers of humanity, a hand offered to a fallen soldier, a whispered word of comfort. As they pushed through the throng, the nurse felt the weight of her duty settle upon her. She was not just a caregiver. She was a warrior in her own right, fighting to keep hope alive in the hearts of those around her. The young man leaned heavily on her, but he was not alone. The nurse felt the warmth of their shared struggle, an unspoken bond that propelled them forward through the storm. In that moment she realized that though the world was unraveling, the human spirit remained unyielding. Each gasp, each cry, each moment of hesitation was a testament to their resilience. There was fear, yes, but there was also an unwavering determination to survive. As they rounded a corner, a sudden burst of light illuminated the path ahead, an unexpected beacon amidst the chaos. The nurse felt a surge of hope, a whisper of possibility that echoed in her heart. They were not just running, they were moving towards safety, towards a future where the sound of gunfire would be replaced by the laughter of children, where the weight of fear could be lifted. With each step, the nurse clung to that hope, her heart swelling with the promise of a new dawn. They were not just escaping, they were embracing life, even in the face of uncertainty. And as they moved forward, a silent understanding passed between them, a shared acknowledgement of their journey, of the battles fought and the ones yet to come. In that fleeting moment, as they emerged into the light, she knew that beyond the chaos, there existed a world waiting to be rebuilt. And in that hope, they found their strength a testament to the resilience of the human spirit.